Andy Whiteman to speak to and move Amendment 3570.3. 6 minutes, please.
6 minutes, Presiding Officer.
6 minutes precisely,
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you. I welcome this debate on developing forestry in Scotland, since it's 9 years since it was last debated in government business. I started my working life in forestry, actually destroying the Birks of Aberfeldy to plant conifer plantations on behalf of the Midland Bank in the 1980s. And I then went on to Aberdeen University to study forestry. And it was whilst I was at university that I campaigned against the afforestation of the peatlands of Caithness and Sutherland. I learned years later that, as a consequence of that, I was blacklisted from employment in the forestry sector. So I've got some experience of this topic. Having said that, we're a little bit disappointed in the lack of ambition that the government has for forestry. On the 22nd of March this year, it will be the 50th anniversary of the Forestry Act of 1967. Notwithstanding devolution in 1999, the statutory framework for forestry and the responsibilities of the Forestry Commission has moved on little. We welcome the complete devolution of forestry, of course, but in addition to reforming governance and new mechanisms to achieve afforestation targets, a new Act could, for example, open with a new suite of statutory purposes for forest policy in Scotland, including climate change mitigation, supporting the rural economy, advancing land reform, environmental restoration and promoting social policy in the fields of health and well-being. In particular, a new Act should incorporate a statutory duty on ministers to promote sustainable forest management and implement the UN Sustainable Development Goal, of which 15.2 states that by 2020 promote the implementation of sustainable management of all types of forests, halt deforestation, restore degraded forests and substantially increase afforestation and reforestation globally. In that light, our amendment calls for two elements of a more ambitious approach to the future of forestry in Scotland. The first relates to the ownership of Scotland's expanding forest cover. This has become dominated by owners who live far away from the land they own, often in offshore tax havens, and whose motivations are limited solely often to the financial and tax advantages associated with ownership. A few years ago, I undertook a study into the pattern of private ownership of Scotland's forests, and I was astounded when I asked the Forestry Commission about the source of ownership data that they had submitted to the UN Economic Commission for Europe in 2011, to be told that it was based upon estimates which in turn were derived from a survey carried out UK-wide in 1977. Unlike most European countries, the Scottish Government and Forestry Commission collect minimal information on forest holdings and publish nothing. What we now know is that Scotland stands at the extreme end of countries in Europe with the most concentrated pattern of private ownership. Over 44% of forest holdings in Scotland are over 100 hectares in extent. Sweden is next at 10%. The European average is 0.7%. The majority of Scotland's private forest area is owned by absentee owners, and a third of those live outside Scotland. Across Europe, by contrast, forestry is owned by cooperatives, communities and municipalities. In countries such as Sweden and Finland, companies such as Södra and Metsalito Cooperative own substantial extents of forests managed on behalf of their members. The second part of my amendment relates to reform of the governance of the National Forest Estate, and I heard what the Cabinet Secretary said in relation to this, and I look forward to further discussions on this. 25 years ago, I asked the prominent historian of the Highlands and Islands, Dr. James Hunter, to write an editorial for a magazine I was editing about the future of forestry in Scotland. Now, contrary to the prevailing orthodoxy of the time, he noted that, and I quote, "The Forestry Commission is to Scottish forestry what collectivisation was to Soviet agriculture." And he went on to argue for reform in the way that state forests are managed, and made a very good point, I thought. Public ownership of land does not necessarily mean state ownership. Real public ownership means ownership by the public. And there's a common belief that the Forestry Commission owns the National Forest Estate. It does not, of course. All land managed by the Forestry Commission is owned by Scottish ministers. Section 3 of the 1967 Act, which the Government is intent on repealing, makes clear that the Forestry Commission is merely the manager of land placed at its disposal by Scottish ministers. A new Forestry Act, in our view, should allow a much wider range of bodies, such as community groups, environmental charities, cooperatives and local councils, who can be appointed by Scottish ministers to manage parts of the National Forest Estate, removing the monopoly currently enjoyed by the Forestry Commission. Finally, Presiding Officer, I want to raise two further matters in the short time I have available. First, on achieving the Government's target for forestry expansion. This will be challenging. As the Forestry Commission briefing helpfully distributed by the Cabinet Secretary yesterday makes clear, we know where forestry expansion should happen in broad terms, but it is not happening. Given the climate change imperative of forestry expansion, we need to develop new mechanisms through planning and fiscal policy to make new forestry obligatory. Second, the Forestry Commission repositioning programme is based on recommendations from a review in 2004. In an answer to a written question in October last year, I was told by the Cabinet Secretary that the Scottish Government has yet to decide on any further sales programme beyond those areas already notified. I understand that the Cabinet Secretary is in fact in possession of lists of new proposed sales of the National Forest estate and will welcome whether he can confirm this is the case or not, and whether he will let Parliament know of such plans as soon as possible. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, is Scotland simply a resource colony for distant corporate, industrial and financial interests, or is it a country to be developed for the benefit of the communities who live and work in rural Scotland? I move the amendment in my name.
We now move to the open speech